For the first several years of its life, the Castlevania franchise was pretty synonymous with Nintendo. The first 4 games were exclusive to Nintendo hardware, barring all the obscure variations of the first game, that is. But nowadays, the series is much less known as a Nintendo series given one of its most popular games was on the PlayStation, but the point is, Castlevania was always owned by Konami, which meant it was never a Nintendo IP. That just happened to be the console the games were made for. But in the 90s, Nintendo's monopoly on the Western game market ended as they got their first taste of viable competition with the release of the SEGA Genesis and its flagship title, Sonic the Hedgehog, beginning a marketing rivalry between the two companies that lasted throughout the early to mid-90s. This is back when console wars were cool, or so I hear. Obviously, I wasn't around in the 90s, but from what I hear from those who were, the Sega versus Nintendo battle was a playground staple. When I was a kid, I and basically everyone I knew had a PS2, borrowing a cousin who had an Xbox, and I didn't know anybody who had a GameCube, so the battle between them was just not that fierce. And nowadays, if you still are a Console Warriors fanboy as a grown adult, you just look like a complete and total weird doofus because we all know PC is better anyway. But back on subject. Since the SEGA Genesis was viable competition for Nintendo, third-party developers started making games for it, hence the topic of today's video. Castlevania Bloodlines, which was a fully original title for the Genesis that came out in 1994, also known as Castlevania: The New Generation in Europe and Vampire Killer in Japan. The idea behind the game was to create something from scratch that would best fit the fast-paced arcade-like action that the SEGA Genesis was known for, instead of, say, porting a game like Super Castlevania 4, which is more methodical by comparison. Not that I'm super literate when it comes to the library of games for the Genesis. I owned a Model 3 when I was a kid, but that was just to play Sonic games, and via various Sonic-themed collections, I have played games like Rystar and Golden Axe and Vector Man and Comic Zone, but it was never a library I was super into compared to the SNES, which I've played far more iconic games on. But I do own a Model 1 Genesis now, as you can see on screen. To be honest, I don't really remember much about Bloodlines. As you may recall, I learned of the Castlevania series' existence from the Some Call Me Johnny videos back in 2011. He ended his marathon with a Bloodlines video, and I recall it having 2 playable characters and having more gore than previous games, and I'm also aware this game was almost left behind. The previous 4 games I talked about have been made accessible on current platforms in various ways throughout the decades since their original releases, but Bloodlines never left the Genesis for a long time. It wasn't until the Anniversary Collection where we got the game re-released on all modern platforms, which is very cool and exciting. Other than that, I was going in pretty much blind for this one. Taking a look at the cover and the back of the box, it shows that the setting and story is quite different from the previous games. It reads, "The Belmont family tree will die unless you unleash your rage on the undead. Time refuses to forget the Belmont family's horrifying, bloody destiny, and in 1917, 2 of its descendants are summoned by fate into epic battle. Their enemy? The most evil incarnation of the Castlevania legacy to ever rise from the grave, the vampiress Countess Bartley. Taste the sweat dripping into your mouth as you try rescuing yourself from diabolical traps. Feel the torturous strain on every muscle as you wield again and again sacred weapon power-ups such as Holy Water, Battle Axe, Crystal Blade Boomerang, and the Mirror of Truth. But in the end, make sure you've saved enough strength to scream." And the manual gives us more context on the story. This game doesn't take place hundreds of years ago like the previous games. Instead, it takes place in the early 20th century. In 1897, Quincy Morris, a Belmont descendant, killed Dracula but died in the process. His son, John Morris, now wields the Vampire Killer Whip, and alongside his best friend Eric Lacard, they continue the fight 20 years later. An evil countess named Elizabeth Bartley, who was the niece of Dracula, seeks to revive him, and it's now up to the new duo to stop her before she can complete her objective. Is your heart strong enough for this challenge? Well, game, we're about to find out. Before you start playing, you'd best mosey on over to the options menu. Set the background music to 5 and the sound effects to 73. Go back to the title screen, let it fade out, press start, enter the Konami code, up, up, down, down, left, right, B, A, and you'll hear a chime. Go back to the options, and now you have the option of giving yourself 9 lives by default. Why do that? Because this game is fucking hard, and I want to have as much of an edge as I could get. The game was meant to be difficult, mind you. I talked about this in the Castlevania 3 video, but to reiterate, a large part of the Western game market in the 80s and 90s was renting games from the video store. This cut into the profits of the companies that made the games. So they make the US versions of games much more difficult than the Japanese ones, so that you likely wouldn't beat it in a single rental period and would either have to get it multiple times or buy the game at full price. In Bloodlines, there are a lot of enemies, they do a decent amount of damage, and the platforming is quite perilous and unforgiving, and to top it all off, getting a game over showed me that this game has limited continues. In the previous games, if I started a new stage with 1 life left, I'd just let myself die to get a game over and a fresh set of lives. In this game, doing that showed me that I used up one of my continues. Losing them all boots you back to the title screen, and you have one of two choices. Input a password to go back to the level you stopped at, or just start the game again. In the Japanese version, the passwords don't track your lives and continues, thus giving you a fresh set. In the English versions, passwords do keep track of how many lives and continues you used. So your choice is just start a new game or try your best with a small set of lives and no continues. As I'm sure you can now imagine, doing this with 9 lives felt far more comfortable than the alternative. I wouldn't even say the game is unreasonable much of the time, just very unforgiving of small mistakes or trying to learn the level design. Thus, 9 lives made it way more comfortable. Anyway, the character selection process is similar to a game like Mega Man X4. You get to choose between John and Eric, and that is the character you play as from then to the final boss. There's no narrative distinction between the two, so there's no reason to play it twice unless you want to see everything the game has to offer. I started with John Morris because he's the character who plays like the Belmonts, using the whip to attack and being able to upgrade it twice to increase the damage and range and all that good shit from the previous games. What's different in Bloodlines is that John does not have the attack range that Simon had in Super Castlevania 4. You can whip diagonally, but only in mid-air, and you can't flail the whip around anymore either. So the controls in Bloodlines feel more like a middle ground between the NES games and the 4th game. What John can do is use the whip to swing from specific ceilings, and while that did feel somewhat nerve-wracking, that at least made swinging more part of the regular level design than the swinging in Castlevania 4. But other than that, like I said, John's gameplay will feel very familiar to anyone who's played the previous games. What is new to this game for both characters is that the basic attack can be leveled up a 4th time for a short duration and can even do a special move for high damage in the place of whatever special weapon you were using. This game also has less special weapons than before, but I thought almost all of them were useful. The axe is as good as ever, the holy water felt less broken but still pretty powerful as it causes an explosion when hitting the ground, and the boomerang was also decently useful at close range. If you have enough crystals, which replaces hearts as ammo, you can do a special attack with the weapons that consume more ammo and do more damage, so that was also cool. The other playable character is Eric Lacard, and he'll be somewhat easy to pick up and play despite not using the whip. Eric uses the Alucard spear to fight and can also have its damage and range increased like the whip. Sometimes the basic stab attack felt more useful than the slower whip strike, but the two weapons are pretty comparable. The one move where he spins the spear around should have been more useful than I felt like it was, but that was just me, I never found a good spot for it. Instead of swinging, Eric can use the spear to vault himself up. This also has some good uses in reaching alternate pathways, but I don't like how you can't move while falling, so it's not super useful in platforming, and you can't really defend yourself on the way down either. So I thought Eric was fine and perfectly playable and all that, but I much preferred using John and definitely will stick to him if I ever play the game again. But ultimately the experience was pretty comparable between the two. What stood out to me about Bloodlines is that the game has a smaller level count than Castlevania 3 or 4. It's back to the 6 stages from the original game, but what's different is how Bloodlines has the most acts in any stage of any game in the series. The first level has 11 acts. Many of its stages have 11 acts, some have 7 or a number between those two. But there are no stages with a small amount of acts is the thing. What helps is that the acts tend to be on the short side, kind of like Castlevania 1, and getting a game over still loads you at the most recent checkpoint just without your score, so the game is trying to keep things balanced while throwing more at you than previous games. What's very commendable about Bloodlines is how much visual variety there is between these stages. Each act will feel very distinct from the last, and every stage will bring a new flair to the game because Eric and John are traveling across all of Europe to stop the Countess, including visiting Greece and Germany and Romania and other locations. The visual variety is quite commendable, as is the sprite work, which is all very detailed and colorful. The music was another enjoyable element too. Genesis music is something you either dig or don't. Some games can really push the boundaries of the sound limitations on Genesis, like the Sonic games, but then, I still think a game that has that typical Genesis sound like Bloodlines does can still manage to produce a pretty good soundtrack. Many of the compositions are original, but of the remixes, I think they sound really great. In fact, this might be my favorite Bloody Tears in the series yet. To look at the levels more in depth, Stage 1 is very simple. Not much in the way of instant kill hazards or anything like that, just one relatively easy mini-boss, and this part where I thought for sure this was some kind of hazard, but it's just set dressing. What isn't is this swinging axe here, but luckily it does kill enemies, which is a good detail. The boss is one where I just spam attacks and hope I win first, though. Stage 2 in Greece was really impressive and fun. The first section paints the sky orange and the clouds purple, which looks really pleasing on the eyes, and they pull this effect with what's supposed to be the rising water. The sprites are flipped on the kill plane to create the illusion of a reflection, and the kill plane just rises up and down to make it look like a tide. I really liked Act 1 for that effect and for the gameplay. In Act 2, there's rising water you need to avoid, and the water here also looks really great. Act 3 is some mini-bosses that are quite simple to dispose of when you get to grips with them, and then you just make your way back down to reach the boss in Act 7. Though I really got my ass kicked in Act 5 as Eric. Not even really sure why, it's the same set piece as John, but the enemies were just really pummeling me more than I'd like to admit. Stage 3 takes place in Italy in the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Thankfully, the lore explains this was shortly before Superman showed up to prank people by straightening it. But seriously, this level felt really creative. It's ultimately just basic jumps, but they tilt the background to give the illusion of being in a leaning tower. Though my only critique is this second act, where it felt to me like it was really confusing to figure out how to get out of here. The answer is just walking right here, but that doesn't look like an exit, so I just kind of kept walking around my first playthrough, not sure where to go. And the exterior sections also have this cool looking effect to create an illusion of jumping around a tower. This kind of shit I'd be used to seeing in a PlayStation 1 game, not a game for the Genesis, so this was another moment where I felt the graphics in this game were ahead of their time. The boss fight here also gave me more trouble as Eric than John, but your mileage may vary. I just almost fell off the edge more often in his run. Stage 4 was much simpler, to the point where I was really blitzing through the first few acts without hassle until I reached this spinning axe room, where I lost a lot of health to these enemies and saw how much damage these axes did if you timed your movement poorly. It's a cruel prank, really. You have to fight a battle against Frankenstein's monster, think the level's over, and get more tough rooms as a result. Then you got enemies at difficult angles over pits before doing another boss. But this too shall be passed with patience and observation. Stage 5 makes me wish I saved the hallway from Hellgag for this video instead of Castlevania 4, because it's much more appropriate here. The part with poison outside isn't the worst thing to deal with, but inside the enemies with their multiple hit points just don't fucking quit and thus handed me my ass on a silver platter. Which makes no mention of this mini-boss with the faces and the magic spheres of doom. I just barely survived by the skin of my teeth in this stage. But then I kinda smoked the actual boss, so that was nice. Stage 6 isn't much to write home about compared to the previous ones. In the platforming section, they play with the perspective a bit, but that's about as hard as the platforming gets, because much of this level is a boss gauntlet. Another reason I felt no shame about the 9 lives thing. Death is first, and he makes you fight old bosses in addition to him. One of which being the boss from Stage 3 with the pits. They take more damage here than they did in the original encounters, but it's sure to be enough to get your palms sweating anyway. I'd recommend trying your best to fight this guy first to get him out of the way. Then Medusa also had a learning curve, where I just had a war of attrition against the first phase, but in the second phase, you need to try and hit her each time she appears in the corner of her room for however many spears she summoned that phase, so that they damage her instead of you. You might not think you're doing it right at first, since she won't be taking any direct damage, but eventually you'll see the pattern here. But then, to hype you up for the final battle, we get a remix of Simon's theme from Castlevania 4 in the hallway leading to Dracula. Speaking of 4, I guess they wanted to make up for his only having 1 health bar in that game by giving him 3 phases in this one. I was actually kind of thinking to myself that the first phase was on the easy side, so I had to eat dirt when I got to the 3rd phase. But when you win, the ending is a bit unceremonious. It's just like, and Dracula's dead, roll credits. But that kind of felt appropriate for the game I just played. Like, yep, we killed Dracula, day is saved, mission accomplished, game is over now. I don't mean to say Castlevania Bloodlines is bad or anything, just that I liked it, but it was definitely Castlevania on Genesis. I think it added to the formula in decent ways, like giving us 2 campaigns and trying to pull back on the mobility from Super Castlevania 4 while also retaining some of it. It's an interesting game and worth playing if you like the classic Castlevania games, which I most certainly do, and it has great visuals and music and stage variety and was fun to play. But it also doesn't really add a whole lot to the franchise if you haven't played it. Like, this is probably the game I'll remember the least of the ones I've covered thus far. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. It just so happens that it was more Castlevania goodness compared to the first 4, which were all huge, massively influential games. It's bound to happen eventually in a long-running series that one of them won't break the bank, but will still be a good game nevertheless, and that's how I felt about Castlevania Bloodlines. Which only leaves the last Castlevania I want to cover in 2025, Castlevania Rondo of Blood for the TurboGrafx 16. Which also got an SNES downport called Dracula X, and a PSP remake called The Dracula X Chronicles. I want to talk about all 3 of these games next time, and I hope folks are looking forward to that. With that said, I'll wrap this up by saying the same thing I always do. If you made it this far into the video, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.